Good morning, everyone. Wow, that was loud. I'd like to call this meeting to order. We are the Special Committee on COVID Response Efficacy, and I would like to ask Representative Lekis to lead us in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd just like to remind everybody that this bipartisan committee is tasked with investigating and evaluating the state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The committee will function in a science-based fact-finding review, specifically acquiring comprehensive, accurate data and all related information pertaining thereto. Areas of particular focus will include the administration of federal guidance, acceptance of federal funds, and implementation of emergency use authorization vaccine efforts. A report will be issued outlining the committee's findings and the impact on New Hampshire. I'd also like to remind everyone that people may have differing opinions, and let's be courteous to each other and treat everyone with respect. And I would like to call Alicia Houston to come before us, please, if you would.
Okay, thank you. I apologize, I wrote everything down on my...
All right, just state your name
Yep.
and where you're from for the record, please.
So, good morning, representatives. My name is Alicia Houston, and I am from Nashua, New Hampshire. I want to start by thanking you for your time today to speak regarding the COVID response in my city of Nashua, New Hampshire. I will be frank, the handling of COVID in the city of Nashua was a thing of nightmares for many adults, parents, and most importantly, for our children. From March of 2020 to February of 2021, the Nashua School District refused to reopen at a full-time capacity for in-person learning. It wasn't until Governor Sununu issued an emergency order for a return to school that forced the hand of the district to reopen for its students. That should not have been the case. You see, from March of 2020 to February of 2021, Nashua's Board of Education, comprised at the time of mostly Democratic elected individuals, there were thousands of children who went without the opportunity to learn freely in any classroom environment, including remotely. The Board of Education in my city never received thousands of taxpayer-funded Chromebooks, which left children without the ability to learn. Additionally, children did not have accessibility to internet in some low-income areas. They essentially declined to make adjustments to afford all Nashua children a fair opportunity at their right to free appropriate public education. They simply didn't care. Now, I'm not simply saying this out of spite. I am saying this from a place of critical thought and after years of reflection on how this could have been more appropriately handled. They could have done better. They could have treated those of us who spoke out in opposition better. They could have been better and overall chose not to do so, along with many other state representatives throughout New Hampshire, in other cities and towns. The city of Nashua imposed a citywide mask mandate for over a year, regardless of data provided to, at the time, mayor-appointed Director of Public Health, Bobby Bagley. At many points throughout the pandemic, questions were asked surrounding the validity of the metrics being used to monitor and determine reopening plans and mandates. All of those questions went unanswered, and when provided direct responses from Cheryl Nielsen and Elizabeth Maynard at the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically laboratory services, which handled the results of all New Hampshire testing, Ms. Bagley remained steadfast in her directive of keeping Nashua closed and masked. New Hampshire never calculated the overall CT viral load value when determining the actual transmissibility of COVID-19, ever. I say this as someone who probed the questions alongside hundreds of others, and yet even with proof of inflated and inaccurate numbers, many felt as though we were screaming from the rooftops and no one was listening. At this time, history and virology were thrown out the window. In addition to deliberately ignoring specific email responses to questions asked at the state level, with confirmation that the data that was being used was not accurate and that we were not actually able to appropriately calculate for transmissibility rates without the CT viral load values, the ways in which those who spoke out were treated was abhorrent. We can do better. As someone who was never involved in politics prior to COVID-19, my only purpose of becoming involved was to benefit the children of Nashua. My involvement and speaking out ultimately resulted in elected officials, including state representatives, labeling myself and others as white supremacist neo-Nazis who belonged to what they referred as teacher sacrificing cults, simply because we wanted children to have access to their classrooms again in person. It was one of the worst experiences of my entire life. Myself and my best friend received death threats. We were cyber stalked. We were doxxed by state representatives. Teachers targeted us and our children, and so much more. All because we spoke up and advocated for a return to in-person learning. Children went without learning, which resulted in later confirmed learning loss. The isolation of denial of access to social settings for children resulted in later confirmed mental health challenges. The implementation of mandatory vaccines for employment resulted in thousands of lost jobs for people throughout the state. Regardless of information that was provided to representatives, elected officials, and appointed leaders in our communities, we were simply ignored, and later realized and confirmed our data points and research, but never even bothered to acknowledge any wrongdoings or apologize to New Hampshire residents for mishandling any outcomes or committed denial of facts. As I sit here before you today, after taking time to reflect on the pandemic responses and the handling of COVID-19, I again say we could have done better. We should have done better. Many asked for honesty, transparency, accurate statistics, and overall human decency. We were mostly met with labels, threats, and so much more. I implore this committee to also reflect on the outcomes of handling of the pandemic and to do better in the future. Thank you for your time. I yield to any questions.
Please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the testimony. In hindsight, what would you recommend could be done differently? Because when we get into something like this, there are differences of opinion. And how do we resolve that difference of opinion and still respect each other's rights? So do you have any solutions?
I would say that reviewing the facts and being open-minded. There was a lot of closed-mindedness, again, reflecting back on how we could have done things differently. It was a very emotional time for a lot of us. But to give an example, we were given specific data and facts, and it would have been better suited for people to read the data and facts as elected officials, taking out the political biases, and looking at it at face value. Because the thing is, we didn't focus on the accurate numbers. And going forward in the future, if you look at the accurate numbers and the statistics and what needs to be calculated in a situation like that, specifically CT values, viral load, if those things are not being calculated and we're basing our decisions on closing or reopening or mandates, things along those lines, if you don't calculate in the things that matter in order to determine the transmissibility rate and we ignore those facts, regardless of differing opinions, numbers don't lie.
Follow up.
That's insightful, so thank you. Do you think this is something that should be done by the state or done by local municipalities? Because I'm a strong believer in local control and not having the state trumpet over municipalities' rights. So in hindsight, again, is this something that really should be done broadly at the state level and take away that autonomy of the municipality, or should it reside in the municipality and the municipality have the resources to actually do what you're recommending?
So that's a difficult question for me to answer. Although I agree with local control, I think that there's a magnitude that goes along with that because every area is different and every area needs something different. I think that there could have been a standard set by the state that the cities should have followed. The state of New Hampshire, specifically the Department of Health and Human Services. I have emails. I would be more than happy to send anybody the email confirmation that needs it. I have to go back into the archives. It's from 2021. So, but setting a standard at the state level of how the tests are going to be handled and what statistics need to be there in order to determine whether or not we reopen or we close schools or mandate masking. Like I said, I have the email. We asked specifically what needs to be calculated in order to determine transmissibility. And if that had been done at the state level for cities like myself, again, it was a very emotional time. I think although local control matters a lot to me, our local control didn't listen to us, regardless of the facts that we presented forward from the state of New Hampshire. So, yes, I would say local control matters, but at the state level, we really needed a benchmark. Things like the reopening mandate of schools that Governor Sununu had the executive order, those things could have happened sooner on so that the kids didn't suffer all that period of time.
Thank you.
Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony this morning. To follow up a little further with the idea of the local control question, I guess I would ask as far as what you think the extent of that should be, given, for instance, that the New Hampshire Department of Justice has a civil rights division, and they regularly will file civil rights charges against people all over the state for various violations or alleged violations at the state level. Do you feel like your civil rights were respected during this process?
So that is an excellent question. I was actually one of the ones that pointed people into the direction of the civil rights, specifically the Disability Rights Center, to file requests for comprehensive services for students that were without in-person learning and at the detriment of their children. Did I specifically have my civil rights violated? In a lot of ways, sure. Mandating different types of things, wearing a mask in order to go to the grocery store because of a mask mandate, not being able to move about freely, to exercise my First Amendment right. Those types of things were absolutely restricted. I would like to keep it specific right now to the children. There were a lot of civil rights that were violated. To give you an example on a personal level, I had a child who had a disability. I had a letter from his pediatrician that it was a mask exemption letter. It was provided to the Nashua School District. My child was chased down hallways. He was called the wrong last name because I am who I am. And I spoke up. He was denied the ability. He was left outside to sit outside by himself at 16 years old. Could I pursue different avenues to seek legal action? Yes. Do I have the ability to afford doing that as a single parent in New Hampshire? Absolutely not. There were a lot of civil rights that were violated. Comprehensive services in my city were automatically denied. There was a blanket letter that was sent out for any special education student. I am more than happy to share any of this. I'm not just talking out of the seat of my pants. These are things that we experienced in real time. But yes, to answer your question in a long-winded way, there were civil rights that were violated. Absolutely.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and also thank you for taking the question. During the testimony, what I heard was that there was an issue with Chromebooks and not having availability to them, which brings up another issue. Do you believe, or would you speak to the fact that a lot of educational funding is done locally and not by the state? Should the state be responsible providing sort of a platform of technology to be sure we have a level playing field, that we don't have a technology gap, so students have the ability to use that technology when they need to? Should it be a state responsibility, or should it be something by local municipalities?
So again, another really great question. The problem with that is bringing it back to local control. It would be really difficult for the state to mandate something along those lines, specific to you need to have X, Y, and Z in order to have these children doing these things, because the reality is funding is going to look different no matter, depending on where you are. Litchfield is going to look different than Hudson. Hudson's going to look different than Nashua. Could we have in the future, if this were to happen, have an oversight to ensure that children have their fundamental right to FAPE, free appropriate public education. I think that that would be something that maybe a committee of some kind could be developed, not necessarily to demand certain actions be taken with taxpayer funds, but to ensure that in an example of the ESSER funds, they needed to provide documentation to the Department of Education on how those funds were spent, maybe doing some kind of audit to ensure that those funds were spent appropriately to benefit the children. I know that in Nashua, a lot of the funding was used to provide teacher payment, which is fantastic. Teachers are wonderful. We need them, obviously. But there were thousands and thousands of children that went without Chromebooks that were purchased but were never received. So I think that some kind of oversight might be helpful as a directive, not as a demand, but kind of like a liaison to assist communities to ensure that they're doing what's best for the children.
Representative Blackus?
Thank you for coming in. Can you give more specific harms that were done during that time? Specifics of various kids or your own child that, particularly any long-term harms or et cetera?
So, my children are going to be so bummed out that I'm talking about them. They're so tired of it. But my oldest son was the one with the mask exemption. So a perfect example would be he would go to school to learn. He had a mask exemption. I provided that documentation. There were no reasonable accommodations that were made. There are so many laws that were violated through that. But the long-term lasting effects, he doesn't want to speak up anymore. The idea of standing up for something is terrifying to him. The idea of me standing up, sitting here in front of you today makes my hands clammy. It makes me nervous. I'm worried that there will be a target painted on my back again, that someone somewhere, because of differences of opinions, will get the bright idea of sharing my address or my phone number with someone, that I will have to look over my shoulder to make sure that the death threats that I received back then were not followed through on. So there are long-term effects. Our youngest son is very, very shy. He missed out on, during COVID, he was in the 5th grade, at the tail end of 5th grade when everything happened. He didn't return back to school again for almost a year. He lost a year. He's a very shy kid. He has a really hard time making friends. They lost a lot of that social interaction. I have friends who have children that were younger going into kindergarten, and from firsthand experiences, they have delayed learning. We have a 63% proficiency rate in, I believe it's math. There's like a 42% proficiency rate for Nashua. And again, I'm spitballing. I don't have the numbers directly in front of me for reading. And those types of things are going to take years to redo. There were no comprehensive services for the special education students. So those long-term effects are going to be long-lasting. Things, occupational therapy was missed. You can't do speech therapy through, with a child who is a visual learner through a computer. If you had a lower income and you didn't have access to a Chromebook, you didn't have access to an education. So speaking specifically to my family, my children were dramatically impacted. I was dramatically impacted. I even, things like looking for a job. There are things out there that were put out into the world that were not true because of differences of opinions, because I spoke up during a time when we needed the facts and we needed the logic. And I was trying to help and aid with probing questions and emails from, heads of departments that proved that we weren't accurately reflecting the numbers. It's terrifying. It's scary to sit up here today in front of all of you and whoever's watching. But those things are going to last a lifetime. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Representative Ebel?
Thank you. I'm sorry those things happened, and even in the best of circumstances, it can be hard to sit here. And after what you went through, I'm sympathetic. So we're not experts at this, and so I was just going through the timeline here of emergency orders, when vaccines first became available, and I'm just wondering, so it says here, in February of 2021, Sununu issued an emergency order mandating schools offer in-person instructions to all students at least 2 days a week starting March 8th, 2021. I was just curious as far as Nashua was concerned, what Nashua did, and were you wanting them to open before that or hoping they would open before that, or did they not comply with the order? I was just trying to think of how all that played out.
So I sat in my car today for like an hour trying to look back. It's kind of like that whole.
Right.
I hate using PTSD, but you get
No, well,
PTSD when
we feel it just
when you go
talking
back
about it.
into the archives and you're like, wait, I can't remember the date and I need
Right.
to remember the date. So we did not return to in-person learning until the executive order, and I don't remember exactly what date it was. It was a 3:00 p.m. Hearing, and Governor Sununu required that all schools return to full-time in-person learning by April of 2021. It wasn't until that emergency order was made that the children returned back to school at a full-time capacity. Even special education students that should have had the opportunity to go back to school, I believe there was an additional executive order or emergency order at some point. I can't remember which one it was. The numbers all come together. But the special education students were afforded the opportunity to go back sooner than that. And again, Nashua refused to reopen at the directive of our Director of Public Health, Bobby Bagley, and the metrics that she set forward until Governor Sununu required that they return to full-time by April of 2021.
Because we can look more at this, but I was trying to figure out when the limitations on public gatherings were, repealed, and how that worked into the options for schools to get back into session if they wanted to. I do see that the vaccines weren't really available until like February of 2021. I talk about PTSD. I'm reading this huge, I'm just, so the other thing I wanted to ask you is, do you have, and I realize you're not an expert anymore than we are, but do you have a sense of how many other schools other than Nashua actually reopened, and was Nashua sort of a laggard?
Nashua is one of the last school districts to open full-time. All of the other school districts, I'm sure that other representatives in different areas could speak to when they reopened. Nashua was forced to reopen. If the governor had not made that order, I will answer bluntly, Nashua was not reopening the schools until someone made them reopen the schools.
So just one more. So we just obtained the after action report that Homeland Security has been working on for several months through a consultant. And I haven't read it all, but it looks like, yeah, maybe you have. But apparently there's a task force, and they're looking into all of these things, not just schools, but in general. So you might want to take a look at that after action report. Be interesting from your perspective to see what you think as far as the schools. But I'm hopeful that by doing this work, we're going to get some help in figuring all this out for the future. Thank you.
I would love a copy of that. I'm sure Representative Likas would send me that over if possible, or I can research it. One of the things that we hadn't talked about that I'll add on to your request and how we could handle things differently, a lot of jobs were lost without a lot of data and facts and statistics. And when you talk about the vaccines, because you had mentioned the vaccines, some of the things that as parents who had been doing the research, things like the National Institute of Health quietly researching the impacts of this vaccination, specifically, I believe it's Johnson & Johnson, and you can research it and look into it, and its impact and effects on the menstrual cycles of females. That has now since expanded. So I would definitely encourage you to look into that study. Additionally, the studies regarding myocarditis. And I had taken my son to a physical. And on the back of the handout that they hand you after years of saying the National Institute of Health is studying whether or not there are, potential interactions or links to myocarditis. It lists it right on the back. So it was an incredibly difficult time for all of us. There's a lot of research that we have now that we didn't have back then. My big thing would be focusing on how this impacts the children in the future. Social interactions, mental health. There was a lot of mental health crises during that period of time. There was a lot of lost learning, a lot of things that are going to take years and years to undo if we can ever undo them or repair them. So that would be something that I would implore this committee to do, is to continue doing the research, read the report from the task force through the Department of Homeland Security, and just keep yourselves educated at the same time as keeping yourself open-minded. We didn't need to make this political. It didn't need to be a right versus left. It needed to be a how do we help the kids, and how do we make sure that these kids have the things that they need in order to continue learning, to grow, because they were inhibited with a lot of things. And the ability to access education.
Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to help clarify timeline and whatnot, I've just sent an email to the committee to read into the record a New Hampshire Public Radio article from November 9th of 2020, in which it describes that many districts in New Hampshire are open, at least for now, with a hybrid or fully in-person model, but Nashua school districts have remained closed since March. So from November, and I believe the testimony is that they didn't open up until March or April of 21. So it looks like they would have been definitely one of the later districts to reopen.
I believe that when I was looking through in the research, I believe it might have been closer to February, but it definitely was after. And the only reason why I'm saying this is because I received a phone call from the governor's office saying, you girls won, the schools have to reopen, because we essentially sent every single email, courtesy copying the governor, and then many, many, many other representatives. So March might be a stretch, but I do believe it was in February at some point. So thank you for clarifying that.
Well, I would like to thank you for being here and coming out and telling your story. I do have a couple of questions for you, and I'm not sure if you can answer them or not. But school districts were giving an awful lot of ARPA funds to help with a lot of the mitigation and to help students. I think I heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that Nashua purchased Chromebooks, but they did not distribute them. Is that a correct statement on my part?
So Nashua purchased, I can't remember the exact number. I'm trying to go back and remember, but there was so much. Nashua purchased Chromebooks from a company, and those Chromebooks were not received. Additionally, the Chromebooks that were distributed were never, there was no enforcing actions to obtain them. Families at the end of 2021 were sent a letter that said, hey, you still have a Chromebook, turn it in or else. And those Chromebooks, a lot of them, many of them, I don't know the exact number. I can find it if I really wanted to. But a lot of those Chromebooks were never returned. So those Chromebooks were not received for the district.
So, okay, so they ordered them, but they were never sent them. Do you know if they were paid for?
I would have to look into how the ESSER money was spent. I do have a couple of Board of Education members that I can reach out to. I do believe that they were received much later on, at a time when we really didn't need them because the kids were already back to school at that point. But I do know that I believe that they were paid for and received at a later time, but they were not received in a timely manner when the kids were in remote learning, when it was essential for them to have access to those.
Okay, thank you for that. Do you know because we are talking about the children and we're talking about the health and safety of everybody in the schools, do you know if any of the money was spent on air filtration systems to try and mitigate the viruses in the classroom so that people could return sooner rather than later?
So they did use some of the funds to update the HVAC systems. I do know that some of that funding was utilized for that. And in several of the schools, there were some schools that were up to date that had been previously updated prior to COVID. But I do know that some of the HVAC systems were updated.
Okay, I guess HVAC system is being updated is good, but did they, I guess the question is did they put air filtration in those systems, which would help, right, so that's just a question that I have.
I
And
would
I'm sure you can't answer that, so.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know that if the HVAC system was installed, I would hope that someone somewhere with the ESSER funds would have said we need to add a filtration system, but I can't confirm it. I mean, you can look at what was and was not spent through the Department of Education in New Hampshire on where the COVID money was spent through the documents that they were required to submit prior to the release of the funding.
I know, listening to your testimony and hearing that you were threatened, that I seem to hear that more and more from people that wanted to get back to school or that were outspoken. We're in a very volatile political environment, unfortunately. And do you think that the government, whether it be at the state or the federal level, helped institute fear that trickled down so that that is really what affected people doing those things to you? And do you think, because I don't know, we can't stop people from their opinions. We all have different opinions. We're unique. We all have different biases based on our situations. But where do you think that originated? If you thought about it, why it became so prevalent? And for you personally, because you were one of those outspoken parents.
I think that there was a certain level of fear-based information. It depends on where you look. It depends on where you're getting your facts and your information. There's still fear that goes along with it, even with the research and the evidence that we have that supports a lot of the claims that people like myself were making back then. I think that there was a political divide, and unfortunately, not many people in that point in time could walk in what my friends and I and people that I spoke with that are like-minded. Not a lot of people could walk in a gray area. It was very much a right versus left, and a lot of people that were unfortunately, I'll speak frank. A lot of the people that were in the Democratic Party did have a very fear-based response based on what they were being told. We were told that this is one of the deadliest viruses ever. I don't remember what the end statistic was, but a virus with a 99 point something % survival rate. That is a very fear-driven narrative. Thinking about how the numbers and the information was reported added to additional fear. To give you an example, you could have gotten bit by an alligator and go to the hospital for an alligator bite. Obviously not in New Hampshire, but to go to the hospital with an alligator bite and being treated for an alligator bite. But if you tested positive for COVID and you died from the alligator bite, it has been proven that sometimes those deaths counted as a COVID-related death. So there was a level of fear, and there was a level of refusal to acknowledge facts and logic and critical thinking, unfortunately, and that happened on the right and the left. Things that could have been done at the state level for from a representative perspective, one of the big pieces, I'm going to say it and you all might cringe, the Parental Bill of Rights that was brought forward in the last legislative session that was shut down at its core when it was initially introduced. A lot of it was specific to obviously curriculum and things along those lines, but forced mandated vaccinations. That was a big thing for a lot of people. So at a legislative level, making sure that the parents feel confident in sending their child to school. We had a child in Nashua that was vaccinated for the flu without a consent form, things like that. But it was very fear driven. It came from the top and it made its way all the way to the bottom. And if you spoke in opposition to the mandates or to wanting to reopen the schools, there were labels thrown out, and it was scary for a lot of us. Other things that legislation might have been able to do at the state level. I don't know if you guys are aware, and I might be misspeaking. And if I am, someone somewhere is going to correct me. Absolutely, I guarantee it. There are no criminal. There are no criminal consequences throughout the state of New Hampshire for cyber stalking or doxing a resident or a citizen. That only applies through, I believe, state law. And again, if I'm wrong, please correct me. Send me an email. I'm happy to correct myself. There is no such thing as a cyber stalking or doxing law that prevents people from doxing residents. It does apply to elected officials, but it doesn't apply to citizens. So someone like myself who speaks out, whose address is shared, who is cyber stalked by a number of people, elected individuals cyber stalking me. You try to seek recourse for that to correct those behaviors so that it stops happening and people learn their lesson, right? As an accountability, don't do things or there are consequences. There were no consequences for a lot of the people that committed these horrible, horrible things against people like myself who spoke out.
Well, I thank you for your candid honesty in your opinions here today, and what you've experienced is just horrific. I think that, like you said, everyone needs to be open-minded and understand where other people are coming from, because we all come from different places and have differing opinions. But we really need to learn to listen to each other, and it's not an us versus them mentality. And I think kindness can go a long way, treating everyone with respect, no matter where their opinion comes from. I think is something that needs to be restored here, and we can start here in this, it really needs to, happen, in my personal opinion, obviously. But I do really appreciate you coming in and telling your story, and I am sorry that your children and then all the other children have these experiences and that have mental health issues now because of it and are behind in their education. So I'm very sympathetic to that. Does anyone else have any other questions? No. Thank you so much again for being here. And if you could email us your testimony, that would be wonderful. That way we'll have your email address, and if anyone has any of the documents that she mentioned would like those emailed, we can get those requested. And we can communicate with you via that. So
Absolutely. And again, I appreciate you all taking some time to listen to me. And I know that I mentioned some of the things that that I had access to. I'm happy to send any information. I will get my testimony over to you. If you want to see any of the documentation, I'm happy to send that. I'm an open book, but I appreciate your time.
Thank you again very much.
This isn't about, I just want to submit this after action report for our record so we can get it up on our site. So I'll get it to our committee assistant.
Perfect.
Okay.
And you do know the other report is on our site
Yep.
also?
Yep.
Okay. I believe is anyone else in the audience wishing to speak? No. Representative Lekis, do you want to please, has some information she would like to share, and she wants to sit up front.
So I can see all your lovely faces.
Please state your name and where you're from for the record, please.
Representative Alicia Lekis, Hillsborough 38.
Move the mic closer to you, please.
There you go. And I appreciate you letting me talk. I am leaving on Monday for Europe for 7 weeks. So I will not be here for the rest of this committee, unfortunately, because I've enjoyed working. Yes?
Do you need someone to handle the luggage?
If you can fit in it, I'll take you. So I had things that I had wanted to say, since I won't be around to say them later. And if you'll pardon me, I did write it because frantically trying to get everything taken care of before leaving, I have not been getting enough sleep. And when I don't sleep, I lose my words. So what is the scientific method? Now, my dad was a physicist. My dad had over 200 patents to his name. He and his friend Freddie Friedrich developed the quartz halogen lamp, which you all, I presume, are familiar with. He developed the lights that are currently lighting the Statue of Liberty. He did a lot of very interesting things. And he drilled into us as kids logical thinking and the scientific method. And what he explained to us was when you have an idea, a theory, a hypothesis, you want to check it out. And it'd be really nice to prove that it's true, but that's next to impossible to do. So what you do instead is you try to prove that it's false. And if you prove that it's false, then you look at it and you take your new information and you revamp your theory and you go from there and you keep working on it until you end up with a theory that you can't prove is false. And why do you want to do that? Well, reality has a way of jumping up and hitting you in the face. So if you're following and acting on a theory that's false, your lamp can fail, your bridge can fall, your patients can die, right? So you don't want to be acting on false information or false ideas. And to prove it false, all you need is one counterexample. And then so you know, okay, it doesn't mean throw out the whole thing. It means that you got part of it wrong. So you go again, you look at it, you put your new information in, and you keep working on it. And when you get to the point where you can't come up with any other rigorous experiment, and by rigorous, one thing you need to worry about is only one variable at a time, right? If you have multiple variables, how do you know what the answer is? One variable at a time. He taught us to look very carefully and see how else might this be? What else might be causing this? What am I overlooking? Etc. This is the way we were brought up as kids. I went on to physics and mathematics. My brothers did similar such things. If you're in a company, you open that up to other people in the company. And, you know, you work together. You're a team. That works. Problem is, if you're in current research in universities and places like that, and you don't get it right to begin with, somebody proves you wrong, instead of the way it used to be, where you would get feedback and go again, and maybe somebody else would then be interested in your idea and following up on it. Now you tend to get your funding yanked and you get made fun of. And you might not get funding again. I mean, it's a very bad scientific environment that we have at the moment, and that's really hard, and it's really hard to make science go forward. So you have a lot of people, unfortunately, not, I think, because they want to, but because the incentive system is don't admit you made a mistake. Don't, you know, hang on to your ideas, because that's the only way you're going to hang on to your funding and keep working. And that's a very bad situation to be in, because reality is reality, right? Whatever we want it to be, it is. So thinking along those lines, we heard an awful lot of it's the science, right? This is the science. Or as Fauci said, I am the science. And I would say that that is the antithesis of the science, because the science is always open. It's always looking, it's always improving. It's always trying to find, where am I not right? You know, where testing and as soon as you stop and say, this is it, this is the science, then when you get new information, you're not going to look at it, because I am the science. And therefore, I'm not going to look at somebody, you know, new information that's coming in. And that can be very dangerous. The theory, well, science has to be nimble, open-minded, and ready to change in the face of counterexamples. And it must change in the face of counterexamples, because somewhere there's a misunderstanding, a misconception. And if you proceed with that misconception, bad things will happen. Now, do you have to have it all right before you act on it? No, because that's part of how you're learning, right? But you have to keep that open mind. You have to keep looking. All right, so an emergency comes up. You act on what you have, but you keep taking in new data. You keep adjusting your theory. You can't stop at any point. You have to keep going. You have to have an open mind, as the person before us kept talking about. It's critical, especially in an emergency situation where there's so much we don't know. You have to keep that open mind the whole time. And when you hear people talking about the science in capital letters, you need to start looking at, what are they avoiding? What's in it for them? Is the decision they're making actually based on science, or is it based on politics or money? Are there counterexamples with other scientists that come up with? Are they looking at them, refining their theory, or are they holding on to their theory without considering they may be in error? Again, why? Pride, politics, power, money? As representatives who need to make the best decisions for our constituents, it's important to ask these questions. It's important to consider conflicting points of view. It's important to look for those counterexamples. It's important to seek out other scientists' points of view. Don't rely on publicized mainstream media to find those scientists. Do your due diligence. Throughout the COVID response, there was a plethora of information out there. Just as we do with bills, if you don't understand the topic, seek out the people who do. Learn from them, educate yourself. The number of people, goodness, all through COVID, who I know I met with, and various other people from my committee and other committees met with, we had the doctors, we had the scientists, we had the guy who came in and spoke in the beginning from industry. He came into our committee and spent a good bit of time explaining to us how you mitigate whatever is going on, you know, whether it's a biological leak, a radioactive leak, or whatever. He explained how it's done. So, I mean, there's a whole lot. We can't know everything. We can't. But if we're faced with something, we at least need to learn as much as we can about it. And the other thing to ask when somebody is telling you, do this, or this is the right thing to do, or this is what we should do, ask what's in it for them. And it may be all that's in it for them is what's best for their constituents or for the kids, as the person before us. But sometimes it's more than that or outside of that. And sometimes what they're suggesting is actually counterproductive to what's best for the citizens or what's best for the kids. And so by asking that, it helps you understand where they're coming from, and maybe if there's something else that you need to be looking at. We had frontline doctors who actually dealt with patients, sick COVID patients. And they were reporting things, what worked and what didn't work. And what happened to those doctors? They were denied access to hospitals. Some of them lost their licenses because what they were saying worked. It worked, but it didn't follow the status quo. Why did we do that? Shouldn't we have tried the protocols those doctors were finding successful rather than taking away their ability to practice and to help patients? We allowed, as the previous speaker said, way too much of our COVID response to become political. And there was no reason for it. I mean, if we have, and that's on both sides, I'm not pointing fingers at any one party or other. It became very political. And when you're faced with something, when you're trying to solve problems and protect people, that's the last thing you want, is for politics to get in the middle of it. One of the ones that stands out to me as being very political, at one point President Trump was fighting COVID, and he made a comment about hydroxychloroquine showing some potential and needing to research it further. But rather than doing so, man, I could not believe the reaction. He says, this might work. You would think this might work means we're going to look at it. No. That became like the evil. The hydroxychloroquine, you couldn't get it. You couldn't use it. And we didn't even look to see what other countries were doing, because there were countries for which it was a great prophylactic who did not get COVID or had very low incidence of COVID because they were taking hydroxychloroquine for malaria or for, various other things. We didn't even look at that because it became a political thing when there was no reason for that. It's a medicine. Search the medicine. Just because somebody you don't like said it doesn't mean that makes it bad. And unfortunately, that's what we saw. They even went so far as to do a study who were given hydroxychloroquine just before they died, when they were dying, when there was no other hope. And then they were given more than what was recorded as the safe dosage when it had been studied. You always say up to this amount and no more. They were given more than that. And guess what? They died. But instead of looking at it scientifically and saying, well, what can we learn from that? Can we learn is it too late to give it? Do you have to give it earlier? We couldn't even do that because we gave more than the recommended dose. So they could even have, the treatment could have worked. We have no way of knowing because we gave them a lethal dose. And even the Lancet, which had published that, withdrew it because they said it was such a bad study. And yet we heard about it over and over and over and over and over. These things go out into the press. Somebody misstates something, somebody makes something up sometimes. And it just has a life of its own. And you can show what was wrong with it, but that doesn't take on the life that the initial misstatement does. If that was really science, we would have backed it up. We would have said, okay, it doesn't work at that. What if we give it a week earlier? What if we work on the proper dosing? You would have followed it up instead of just developing this faulty study and then that's it. We proved you can't use it. We proved it's no good. End of statement. Let's go on. And so that's politics, not science. And then you have to ask why. Now, by then they knew they were working on vaccines. They started working on vaccines very early on. But they also knew if they were going to bring this vaccine out, whatever vaccines they brought out, It was probably going to have to be under emergency use authorization. But to do that, you can't have any treatment that works. So if you have a treatment that works, you can't bring out that vaccine. So is that why they did it? They had to prove there was, things that looked like they were going to work. Ivermectin was another one. There were countries all over who were using ivermectin very successfully. There were doctors who were using ivermectin very successfully, frontline doctors. Some of them lost their licenses for doing so, even though it was approved for any use, right? It was determined to be completely safe, and doctors had been using it for other uses for a long time. Now we can't have that. Why was that? Was that science? Was that politics? Was that money? Was that power? We got to look at that. Why did we make those decisions? Why did we do that? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, in India, they couldn't vaccinate everybody. They didn't have the in the beginning when it came out. So they sent these people into the poor, hard to reach places with these med packs. And in them, it had things like vitamin C, vitamin D, ivermectin, some of the things that have been found to work. And the people who were going in there were taking them. They found that those people did not get COVID. And that was, you could look at that as a really big live action study because other regions of India were being highly infected. But where they used that, and that was just supposed to be a stopgap until they could get the vaccines there, but it worked. And yet we said you can't do that. So why? Why? What is the science and what is the not science? What is behind the decisions we were making? Then there was the question of masks, which was brought up by, again, our previous speaker. Prior to June 12th, 2020, many experts, including Fauci and the WHO, spoke about the essential uselessness of mask wearing in relation to a virus like this, an airborne virus. According to a report by the BBC's Deb Cohen, the WHO changed their experts' finding on the essential uselessness of masks in June under heavy political pressure. Is that science or is that politics? By March 2022, the vast majority of school buildings nationwide were shut down. At their peak, the closures affected at least 55.1 million students in 124,000 U.S. public and private schools, reported Education Week. In order to slow the spread of the coronavirus, governors in 48 states either ordered or recommended that schools remain closed through the end of the 2019-2020 academic year. That would be, June. Parents were quite understanding at this point. Schools were dealing with high levels of uncertainty, danger, and frequently shifting expert guidance. However, they fully expected schools to figure out how to reopen by the fall. And as we heard in one of our first hearings from the industry expert who came to speak to us, what they could have done to reopen. They got the money. They could have used it to put those filters in that kill the virus. Even the schools like Alvern in my town who are too old, we don't have an HVAC system. We have radiator units, We could have put filters in there. We had the money too. I mean, that came from the federal government. So there was no reason following the science for any of the schools to have stayed closed in the fall. They had the money, they had the time, and the know-how was out there. In June, Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, told Fox News that in order to reopen safely, schools would need more resources. We need the money for PPE, Weingarten said. We need the money for extra teachers. We need the money for extra cleaning and extra buses. The federal government responded with the CARES Act, including $13.2 billion in emergency funding for schools across the country to use for their core functions, as well as for coordination of preparedness and response to the coronavirus emergency, technology acquisition, mental health services, and activities related to summer learning. Nonetheless, most schools only offered online instruction. A national survey conducted by Common Sense Media in August found that 59% of teens reported that they believed online learning is worse than in-person learning, whereas only 19% reported the opposite. Some teens, being teens, disliked remote learning so much that they figured out how to take a screenshot of themselves looking engaged and posting it so they could leave the virtual room and go do what they wanted to. Of the public schools that did reopen for in-person instruction, most imposed mask mandates and social distancing. But many of the schools which at first reopened then closed again. Parents started showing up at school board meetings demanding that schools reopen. One might say that the parents' demands were unreasonable, except private schools were reopening safely. More than 8 out of 10 private schools associated with the National Association of Independent Schools reopened in the fall of 2020 with full or partial in-person instruction. Nationally, by mid-October, about 60% of individual private schools were fully in-person, while just 5% were remote only. Meanwhile, more than 9 out of 10 Catholic schools reopened for in-person instruction. And I'm not sure exactly what the percentage was in New Hampshire, but what I do know that it didn't take long for every single private school in the state to be full. Because the parents whose schools were not open, they just took their kids and enrolled them in private schools or Catholic schools, whatever. And there was not a place for a single other child. A number of the schools were doing what they could to expand to take in these extra kids. So again, I have to ask, is that science or is that politics or what is that public schools aren't open and private schools are? And private schools, we didn't hear about any great epidemics of COVID. There was no higher incidence than there was in the general public. The long-term closing of schools and the harm it did to children academically, socially, and emotionally was a decision based not on health, but I would say on politics, thanks to teachers' unions. Stanford University did a study which found that public schools in areas with stronger teachers' unions were substantially less likely to reopen in person, even after controlling for differences in local demographics. School districts in states that required union membership were 25% less likely to plan to reopen with full-time in-person instruction than school districts in right-to-work states. The relationship between unionization and reopening decisions remains substantively and statistically significant even after controlling for school district size, coronavirus deaths, and local infection rates. A study published by Brown University's Annenberg Institute concluded, contrary to the conventional understanding of school districts as localized and nonpartisan actors, we find evidence that politics, far more than science, shapes school district decision-making. Mass partisanship and teacher union strength best explain how school boards approached reopening. A study by researchers at Michigan State University found that when governors left it up to districts whether to have in-person education, the decisions were more tied to local political partisanship and union strength than to COVID-19 severity. In New Hampshire, the Commissioner of Education was working diligently to help schools reopen. You remember when he came and talked to us and he gave us that whole outline of all the notices sent out from them, and any school, they were happy to go and help them reopen. But all too many refused to do so. We were told that they were just following the science. But to understand why the schools really closed down, we needed to follow the political science. Unions represent the interests of their members. That means the teachers' unions represent the teachers, not the students or their families. It was in the interest of students and their families for schools to reopen. But the unions believed it was in the interests of their members to keep schools closed and to use the prospect of reopening as a bargaining chip under the pretext of safety, to extract concessions that were entirely unrelated to COVID safety. On July 24th, 2020, Randy Weingarten declared, "Let's stop the debate about whether safety matters and start rolling up our sleeves so we can get the resources to meet the needs of the students, whether we're teaching remotely or in person." Unions declared that they couldn't reopen because the federal government must provide schools with the resources we need to reopen in a reasonable manner. It soon became clear that the money and politics, not science, were in play. Some of the demands made by some teachers' unions included, get this, a federal bailout, socialized medicine, defunding of the police, tax hikes, a moratorium on new charter schools or voucher programs, police-free schools, canceling rents and mortgages, a moratorium on evictions, foreclosures, and taxing billionaires and Wall Street. I'm not sure what that had to do with science or reopening schools safely. But this was going on across our country, and it did affect the teachers' unions in New Hampshire. They might not have been petitioning, but they were listening. More and more research is showing that reopening schools will not overly endanger students and staff. Lance Azumi, Senior Director of the Center for Education at the Pacific Research Institute, told the Los Angeles Times in October 2020, "Schools are not super spreaders and school infection rates are low even in places with high community rates." Meanwhile, it was already becoming clear that learning loss was happening, and this is in October of 2020. In December 2020, a McKinsey report warned of the high cost of this prolonged period of remote learning, from rising rates of depression and anxiety to the loss of student learning. The research showed that the cumulative learning loss could be substantial, especially in mathematics, with students on average likely to lose 5 to 9 months of learning by the end of this school year. That would be June of 21. In spite of this evident learning loss and parental pressure on public officials to reopen schools, unions did everything possible to keep schools closed. Despite all the evidence that opening schools was safe, unions held protests against reopening. They displayed mock gravestones, makeshift coffins, and their own early obituaries. Others used fake body bags and signs with things such as, "I can't teach from the grave." 2 weeks to slow the spread turned into 2 years to flatten a generation. The unions also worked behind the scenes to influence the federal agencies that school districts relied upon to interpret the science regarding COVID. In early 2021, the CDC was about to issue new guidance for reopening. Documents obtained via FOIA requests by Americans for Public Trust revealed that the major teachers' unions heavily lobbied the CDC to influence that guidance. Emails acquired by the New York Post revealed that CDC reopening guidance used the language suggested to them by Randy Weingarten's AFT, and in some cases, practically word for word. On the same day that the CDC released its reopening guidelines, the AFT issued a press release praising the CDC for producing a rigorous roadmap based on science that our members can use to fight for a safe reopening. They praised the guidelines for including compulsory masking, 6 feet of physical distancing, hand washing, cleaning and ventilation, diagnostic testing, and contact tracing, as well as vaccine priority for teachers and school staff. In addition, the AFT thanked the Biden administration for its $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan and for creating a culture of trust and collaboration with the union. And I did not write down, but a later amount was more money than was spent on completely rebuilding the countries we rebuilt after the war, after World War II. It was a huge amount of money that was given to the schools. So that all sounds good, right? What's wrong with that? Except we know that the science had already shown that masks don't work for airborne viruses, partly as was explained to us, but partly as was, from the industry experts, but partly as was explained to us by Dr. Fauci and the WHO in the very beginning. So it's not like, oh, we just made that up. And if you want to look at who might know whether or not it works, look on the sides of the boxes. It says, do not use for children under 12 years of age. It says, does not work to prevent COVID transmission, does not work to prevent catching COVID. It says right on the box with the masks. So, somewhere in there is the science, and somewhere in there is something that's not science. And if the very people who are developing and making the masks say this doesn't work for what you're wanting to use it for, I would hope we would at least listen to them. And in addition, we now know from a study done by Environmental and Water Chemistry for Human Health Group that masks not only don't stop COVID, but they may release up to 5,390 microplastic particles in a 24-hour period. And surgical masks in particular may release approximately 3,152 microfibers in less than 1 hour. And some of those are PFAS. So we have made people for 1 to 2 years wear these masks that have higher levels of PFAS than we've been trying to outlaw in the state of New Hampshire. In addition, talk about science, the 6-foot distancing was made up by a schoolgirl for her science fair project. That's where that came from. But her dad was a modeler, and her dad took that, and back when Bush was trying to come up with what are our national emergency plans, the guy presented it. And the immunologists and the doctors were there who said, that's not going to work. But she said masking and 6-foot distance. That was her theory for her science fair project. Her dad, took it. The experts all said, you're crazy. That's not going to work. Why are you even listening to that? But the dad, what I say, was a modeler. He had snazzy presentations, and the government took it and listened to him instead of the experts. So there's science for you. Not. And contract tracing, one of the other things, that was used to shut down whole classrooms at a time for like 2 weeks at a time. So one kid had been in contact with somebody someplace who might have had COVID, and now his whole classroom and anybody he's been in contact with can't come to school for 2 weeks. And what was the CDC planning on saying before the teachers' unions got hold of them? All schools can provide in-person instruction. That was their plan. That was what they were going to say. In a text message exchange later revealed by a FOIA request by the Fairfax County Parents Association, Weingarten raised concerns about this language with the CDC Director Walensky. The CDC's final language was significantly wimped, changing the word can to have options to, so that the guidelines read, all schools have the option to provide in-person instruction, which is not the same as all schools can do this. Other important guidance was also arranged to be altered by the AFT. There's a whole list of them. You can go and read it. So the guidance which wrought such havoc with our children's education, ultimately setting them back at least 2 years, rather than being based on science, was based on union political machinations. The very unions dealing with teaching and education were responsible for the anti-education which took place. Once again, politics rather than science. And you say 2 years, well, you know, in 2 years they'll make up for it, no problem. Except that people's brains develop in a sort of a logical, chronological order, and at various times they're more or less receptive to learning certain things. And so, yeah, you miss a week, you miss a month, but you miss 2 years, you may well have missed that whole time period where the brain is ready to receive certain things. All those kids who had trouble speaking, they're learning how to talk. They're learning what it's all about. No, you have a mask, and you can't hear, and you can't see what anybody's doing with their mouth. How are you supposed to know how to make those words? How are you even supposed to hear what those words are? We had a bill on something completely different, but having to do with special needs education. And somebody from the special ed administrators organization was in talking to us. And she was talking about how they couldn't get sufficient people to come into all the schools to teach what the kids needed. And somebody, might have even been Rep Belcher over there, asked, why are there so many, you know, why is there such a greater need than normal? And her response was a simple one-word response: COVID. I'm hoping she'll come and be able to talk to you sometime in the next few weeks. Because I went and talked to her afterwards and I said, COVID, why COVID? And she said, well, masks and school closures. The number of speech therapists that are needed now to try to teach those kids how to talk, who spent 2 years with masks and everybody around them wearing masks, we don't have that many speech therapists in the state. Trying to get the services for these kids, they're not able to do that. And the school closures, she said, kids sat and watched the boob tube. You know, for all that time, you know, they weren't learning. And as you saw what some of the teenagers were doing, they weren't even present. They were doing whatever they wanted to do. Along with the anxiety, the mental difficulties, etc., from having gone through that. It's rough. And so I'm hoping, she said she would put together, talk to all the other administrators in the state and in her organization, and hopefully she'll be able to come and tell you, because she said yes, she has lots of data and she will be happy to share the data. So COVID. I didn't want to quite go to the vaccines yet. I wanted to comment about the masks, because the masks were very divisive. My daughter-in-law's dad was sick. He was slowly dying. So everybody had to have masks. Her kids, who lived in the same place, could not see their grandparents, because if they didn't wear their mask, they might kill their grandparents. If they touched the grandparents, they might kill their grandparents. What a horrible thing to do to a kid. They came to see me outside. 6 feet wasn't enough. 16 feet. They had to stay away. They didn't understand why they couldn't come and give me a hug. I was fine with it, but I couldn't wear a mask because I had really bad asthma at the time, and putting the mask on dropped my O2 noticeably. Anytime I go to the doctor's office, of course, you have to wear the mask, and they take the O2 and they'd look startled and concerned and they'd say, drop your mask. And I drop my mask, and then they'd sigh relief because my O2 would pop up. Okay, it's just the mask. And I'd have to put it back on again. Well, I'm not running around wearing a mask that's keeping my O2 long enough that my nurse is concerned. You know, that was the last I ever saw my grandkids. Because I didn't wear a mask. Because I couldn't. It was a long time ago. They used to come all the time. I'm not unique. I hear this story over and over and over. Families who never see each other, friends who never see each other, for something that didn't even work, that we knew didn't even work, and we mandated it anyways. I hope we never do that again. This brings us to the vaccines. We've learned through the testimony of Aaron Siri how science was totally ignored. All of his evidence came from the vaccine manufacturers and the FDA and CDC through what they had published on their own and that which was acquired through FOIA requests. I'm not going to go over these. We had 7 hours and an extra 2 hours while they presented all of that. But I just want to remind us that many signals were apparent long before the testing was finished. And according to precedent and law, the tests should have been stopped and the vaccine declared unsafe at that point. Instead, in the middle of the tests, the experiments, they changed the definitions and testing criteria. How scientific is that? Oh, we're getting signals that says this is not safe. This is dangerous, in fact. Well, let's just change our criteria so it looks better. That's not science. Where is that considered proper scientific methodology? Besides failing their own tests, which the FDA knew, but okayed the vaccines anyway, they totally redefined them. A true vaccine is understood to keep the vaccinated individual from getting the disease as well as stopping the transmission of the disease. That's how a vaccine was always defined. But they had to change that because they realized these vaccines didn't do that. People still get vaccinated and still get COVID. People still get vaccinated and spread COVID. So the whole idea of having vaccine mandates, mandating that somebody take something into their body which they don't want or don't consider to be healthy for them, because somehow that's going to stop COVID, except we know it wasn't going to. So why, again, where's the science and what were those decisions actually based on? Only the drug companies, in their early public reports, admitted they didn't seem to be the case, and in fact, they had too little information to determine its efficacy. And yet we were repeatedly told that the vaccine was safe and effective. We are not clear of blame here. 5 minutes of research would have given us that. Some people did that 5 minutes of research and they put it out, because it was in the original posts posted by those vaccine companies. And yet we allowed those mandates to take place in our state, knowing, or could have been knowing if we had even bothered to look, that that the vaccines weren't going to do what we were expecting them to do. And so there was no reason to mandate them. It should have been an individual decision because we weren't protecting anybody. If we were truly interested in science rather than politics and money, we would have not mandated vaccines for anyone, especially children and pregnant women. You don't take chances, or normally you don't take chances with children and pregnant women. Those are like hands off. But we did. In fact, a study was done to determine if the vaccine was safe for pregnant women in their first trimester. The results looked very bad. The incidence of miscarriage after the shot was given was many times higher than normal. I tried to go back and look up those numbers. I read that study at the time. It was huge, but of course it disappeared as so much information at the time. So many studies disappeared. Well, that one was disappeared as well. Well, they couldn't bring out that and say, oh, it's really not safe. You're way more likely to have a miscarriage. So what did they do? They added a huge number of third trimester pregnant women to bring down that number so they could say, only the incidence is only a little higher. And there was a little asterisk on the study that said that's what they did. In tiny print, you had to read it, but it was there. It's not how you do a study. That's not science. Then they publicly stated that the vaccines were safe and effective even for pregnant women in their first trimester, even though they knew that wasn't true, even though their studies showed what a huge increase it was for women to have miscarriages. How many babies died because we followed the politics and money rather than the science? How many moms are dealing with guilt of having listened to the lies and having killed their much desired babies? I personally know of one, a nurse at Concord Hospital. She and her husband desperately wanted a child, but she was a healthcare worker and was thus mandated to get the shot. Remember, when we passed that bill that said that if you take state money, you can't mandate the shots, we exempted public health care workers. Since she was in her first trimester, she asked her doctor if it would be safe. He regurgitated the standard, the vaccines are safe and effective, and that she should get the shot to prevent the baby from getting sick in case she were to catch COVID. Her baby died shortly thereafter. But we now know, even if she had successfully delivered the baby, because she'd been vaccinated, her milk would cause the bifidobacteria in her baby's gut to die off. Bifidobacteria is an important part of our immune system. Newborns are supposed to have a ton of bifidobacteria. 90% of the microbiome of babies is bifidobacteria. One of the common findings in autistic children is the loss of bifidobacteria. How many sickly or autistic children will we now have because we followed the politics and money rather than the science? I went and talked with those healthcare workers who were protesting outside of Concord Hospital because in not too many weeks they were going to have to be vaccinated or lose their jobs. About 20% of the workers at Concord Hospital. And I asked them, now let me get this straight. You guys worked through COVID. You didn't mind coming in every day, risking getting COVID, and a number of them said, and we did, and doing your job in that horrible time. And now you just have to get a vaccine or you lose your job, and you're not willing to get the vaccine. You were willing to work during COVID, but you're not willing to work. You're not willing to get the vaccine. You're willing to lose your job. What have you seen? Why did you make that decision? And the story started. the woman who got her vaccine and her body became quickly filled with blood clots, she was out of work for a long time. The woman whose doctor, when she had gone to get her flu vaccine the year before, she had had a mild reaction, and the doctor had said, you should probably never get any other vaccines because I think you've become allergic to them and it could be very dangerous. But she had children and no husband, and she needed to support those children. And she went to her doctor, well, what do you think? Well, you could have a serious allergic reaction. Well, can you write me a medical exemption? No, I can't do that because if I did that, I would lose my job. So she got vaccinated because she didn't want to lose her job because she didn't know how she was going to support her kids. She was within 7 seconds of being brain dead before they managed to get oxygen started through a tracheotomy. And the list went on. And that's why they weren't willing to take those risks, nor should they have had to. And I remember how ugly it was then. I remember some woman, a nurse, 3 young children, sole supporter. And she said, I don't believe in this, I don't want to do this, etc. And they said, all right, you don't do it, you're fired. And she got the vaccine. And I remember people on the press were crowing about it and laughing. She had no principles. She just needed to be bought. No, she needed to take care of her children. She had principles that unfortunately she had to give up in order to make sure her children could eat and had a place to live. And yet people were making such horrible fun of her. I don't want to live through that again. I can remember sitting at an ice cream stand with my friend and her kids. We'd gone camping. We stopped for ice cream. We're sitting at the picnic table and we're talking about some of the things that we'd recently learned, studies that we'd recently read. Lady in the other table, oh, this is terrible. And she comes over and starts chastising us and berating us, and we should have got vaccinated, and, that's all baloney, and we're not scientists. How can we study that? How can we possibly understand that? She's a scientist. Well, come to find out, she had fewer qualifications than either one of us did to understand what those studies were. She knew nothing. She didn't know who we were. She just came and started berating us for not getting vaccinated. And finally, I looked at her and I said, lady, you know nothing about me. If I took that vaccine, I'd be dead, most likely. I have so many autoimmune issues. There's no way I should take that vaccine, but you didn't know that. She kind of vaguely apologized, but then made sure to shake her finger at us and still tell us we shouldn't talk about those things. That's the society we were living in. And it was ugly. We couldn't know about the lack of efficacy of the vaccine, nor the dangers associated with it. That's not that we really couldn't, but they were going to make sure we couldn't. The government had social media platforms censor the information available. I had many entries on Facebook censored for supposed misinformation. I would post actual studies, not commentaries, made by reputable and well-regarded hospitals, and they would be declared misinformation and people couldn't read them. They'd be blanked out with that misinformation across them. I remember one of them early on was doctors working at the hospital, and they said, we're killing people because their lungs aren't filled with liquid. We're treating them as if their lungs are filled with liquid. What we're finding is their lungs are filled with blood clots. And when we use the ventilators, we're actually blowing out their lungs. And at the same time, there was a video by a nurse who was in tears because she was trying to treat these people. And she was watching them be killed before her eyes by doctors who were blowing out their lungs. Now, she assumed they were just using too high a pressure. But if that study could have been not misinformation, maybe people could have read that and said, oh, this is inappropriate treatment, and maybe a lot of people's lives would have been saved. But no, we couldn't have that misinformation, so they kept blowing out people's lungs. That's just ridiculous. And the number of times I look back at those studies later, well, I can't see them, but I remember what they were. And I can go back to the Facebook page and I can comment, funny how this is now accepted as true, fact. But it was misinformation at the time, even though it was a real scientific study with real facts. That can't be misinformation. They can be mistaken in their conclusions, but what they saw is what they saw, right? The test results are the test results. But the government went to some lengths to make sure we didn't know the truth. When too many people who had been vaccinated began to get COVID, they changed their testing protocols. Initially, they had set the cycle thresholds to 40 CT, even though there was an apparent scientific consensus regarding the unreliability in favor of false positives of all PCR tests operated beyond 30 to 33 CT. But when they noticed too many vaccinated getting COVID, they adjusted it to 28 CT for the purposes of calculating the number of cases suddenly appearing in the cohort of the vaccinated. At the end of 2021, our Department of Health and Human Services was strongly advertising that the vast majority of people coming down with COVID were the unvaccinated. Only I happen to have a large stratal pulmonary embolism at about that time. And I was in the hospital. 3 different nurses, 3 different departments, 3 different floors of the hospital. When they found out that I was a state rep, they made sure to tell me that most of the people that they were seeing with COVID were the vaccinated, not the unvaccinated, in spite of what our Department of Health and Human Services was advertising. And you could see them on all the TVs and the banners flowing across, etc. So I mentioned that to another rep, and she called the department and said, so I see you're advertising that the majority of people who are getting COVID right now are the unvaccinated. Oh, yeah. Can you give me the numbers? Well, we have no way of tracking that. We really can't figure, Well, how can you say that the majority of people is one way or the other if you can't even track it? I would love to ask the department that. Maybe you can do that. So my question is, what was in it for him to completely make up the science that most of the people were unvaccinated when he couldn't even, he couldn't track those numbers at all? Why? We keep learning more and more things about what was known and what was not known, both from whistleblowers and FOIA requests. Why did people ignore science at the expense of people's lives and livelihoods? I believe that is a question we need to answer if we're going to not make the same mistakes again. We need to learn to look past the politics, the money, the power, to see the beauty of the truth. We need to school ourselves in looking at multiple points of view, in realizing that if there are multiple points of view, then perhaps our idea, theory, hypothesis is wrong or incomplete. We need open pathways of communication which allow us to gather as much diverse information and points of view as possible. We need to be open to these contrary ideas regardless of which party they come from. No one has a monopoly on science. We need to be sure to follow actual science, not politics, power, or money. So I'm open for questions or comments.
Representative Merchant.
And thank you, Madam Chair, and also thank you for taking the question, Representative Likas. First and foremost, I hope you have a wonderful time in Europe.
Thank you so much.
7 weeks sounds like a great time to get out of here. Also, my condolences to you and your grandchildren. That's a very sad story to hear. I've also heard from other grandparents having something comparable to it. It tore families apart politically. So I reach out to you with a lot of empathy.
Thank you very much.
I think your testimony speaks to what I consider to be the 3 Ps. You can throw a fourth one there as well. It comes down to is profits, power, and politics. And fundamentally, where science lies in that, I'm not sure. But also the 4th P is paranoia. There's a tremendous amount of fear of the unknown. And I think you're hitting upon the issue of how do we deal with the psychology, not so much the science, but the science of people, psychology of people, how they respond to the unknown and the fear. It's something maybe we should be thinking about embedding into anything going forward, both at the state and the national level. But I think fundamentally, when you get in, we as a person, as a society, get into something we don't understand, fear takes over. And when fear takes over, it's not just politics. It's the issue of how do we deal and how do we help people get through that fear. So thank you for the testimony this morning. I think it's insightful, and I hope you have a wonderful time in Europe.
Thank you. And to follow up on what you just said, we should look at what we did to expand fear and what we could do to decrease fear. Because certainly telling kids that if they didn't wear masks, they'd kill their grandparents, I think that kind of expanded fear and not decreased it. And that is something that was being said to young children, which is unfortunate. But yeah, and we talked a little bit about that in our very first or second meeting with Homeland Security, is how could we have addressed the situation to begin with? And how, in the future, when we have unknown, how can we address the situation? I think that's a great thing to look at.
I concur. I would say, unfortunately, we get into the political part of it, which only drove the fear.
Right.
It became divisive. And unfortunately, we didn't find ways to reach across the aisle collectively and talk about how we can help people address the fear issue and build some trust within the institutions for them to rely upon. Instead, we didn't do that as a society, both at the state level and the federal level.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Representative Abel.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Representative Merchant said. I had a situation where my mother was in a nursing home, and I couldn't see her for, I don't even, she was 95.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was very difficult time. So I would say what you're talking about is the point of this committee. I think that our country and the world was ill prepared to deal with a pandemic. And I'm really hoping that by looking at how we reacted to it, we're going to do a lot better next time. And I think that the lack of preparedness and the lack of knowledge and the scrambling created a vacuum where fear and politics could pour in, and we just didn't have the resources and the know-how to react properly. I mean, I'm glad, for instance, that the governor had this after action report done, because they pointed out things, and we should be able to do better next time. And I think truly understand that pandemics like this can happen like in a matter of a week or two. I mean, it spreads like
Yes.
crazy. And
Yes.
maybe do less panicky scrambling. So thank you.
I would like to thank you for being here and telling your story and how difficult life got for you. I know many people that it got very difficult for. That being said, I hear the stories with the mandates with vaccines. I hear the stories with kids being vaccinated or injected with with something without parental consent. And yet there's no recourse for those parents, and the harm is done. I think, my personal opinion, is that we need to put something in place to penalize those people that are not doing their due diligence and listening to parents and understanding that just because they think and they're based on whatever they're hearing, they want everyone to be injected with a vaccine or a flu, that there has to be consequences for their actions. Because if we don't have consequences for our actions, it doesn't matter if we listen. And we see the consequences of what happened with the fear in this country and with people. I know I had someone come up and scream at me in my face. And I was following the social distancing, that made up number. And yet they were right here. No matter what it is that comes down the pike, and I think you pointed out, Representative Merchant and Representative Ebel discussed it, is that we need to be open-minded and we need to react in a positive and not a negative thing. We heard in testimony here from one of the commissioners said that one of the things that they did is they set a course and they didn't veer from it, which means that was it. No matter what happened, they were staying on track. And to me, when new information comes in, you have to pivot. And they weren't willing to pivot. That scares me. Data is changing all the time. And the fact that people are posting things that went against the narrative, and I'm going to just say this is a narrative, from what was popular, because that it was taken down and considered disinformation. If we can bring all people to the table, even those you disagree with, I find that through opposing views, you get to the truth. Because nobody is right all the time. And if we all are looking through a lens of bias. And if we take that and get down to the root, and we can all understand where everyone's coming from, and then why this person is saying that this is working, why this person is saying that is working, and collaborate. That I don't believe was done. And I truly believe that the people that suffered most under this pandemic are the children. The mental health issues we're going to see for decades to come are untold. Because we put such fear in them, and those young minds cannot process it. I see adults still today fearful, living in fear that we're vibrant people, and now they're like a shell of themselves. It is amazing what leaders can do to people. And I think we need to learn that leaders in our state and anywhere, no matter where you are, whether it's the teachers or, the CEO, we have responsibilities to encourage people to be the best of themselves. And how do we diminish instilling fear in them where they can't even function? And I think this is where the psychology of all of this comes into. And we have to be able to discern the money, the power, and the politics. And we, like I said, we all come from different biases, but it is our children that has suffered the most. I was just at a conference, and one of the topics that was brought up, the gentleman, it was looking at lenses and saying, you're going to have to convince me that I need to take the COVID vaccine. You should have heard the room. They were like, you're going to bring up that topic. And so we had to get into groups and how to convince this person why they should take the vaccine. It was very difficult for a lot of people to be having that discussion. But they couldn't get past the narrative that we've been told at the top. Some people understood because they had someone that passed away. Other people had, we all come from different lenses. But to say something is safe and effective when other people have experienced deaths because of that, or the miscarriages, or the health issues that are so easily glossed over. And I really thank you for bringing all of that up in your testimony today. And I think it's important that this committee really look at how we can respond. And I think the Honorable Betty Gay, when she was here, had some really good insight into collaborating with all different people going forward to come together. And I really think that as a state, we did well, but I think we can do better. So thank you. Have a wonderful vacation. Not seeing anyone else in the room, I guess I'm going to put this question to the group. We can call it a day. Okay, so I think we'll call it a day. I think at some point we should come back to discuss the Homeland Security report. Representative Belcher.
Thank you. I just wanted to speak on that real quick because I'm aware that it was already read into the record earlier, this report, the after action report. However, there's a provision early in this report that I saw as browsing through that I think we're going to need to get some advice and counsel on to figure this out, because despite the fact that I've already perused this whole report, and it seems perfectly fine to me that it should be public knowledge. However, there's a beginning here. This is actually a classified report, and this is not for public disclosure and internal use only. And there appears to be penalties attached, as far as I can tell, within the law that I've just looked up for this. So I think we need to get a little bit of guidance on why and whether this is something that we need a non-public session, a public session. I'd certainly like to discuss it publicly because there's certainly things in here that I think could be useful. But there it is.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention. And Representative Ebel.
I did share it with you, but it was associated with a press release by the governor. So they, I don't disagree with you. That was I mean, I read that first thing and I'm like, I don't understand what's going on here, but, I just wanted to say that it did come through the governor's office, so apparently at least they made some kind of a determination that it was public. There's, I mean, since I had obtained it originally, there's a contact name there, and if I don't mind giving that person a call and just making sure what the circumstances are, if the committee would like me to do that.
I would truly appreciate that.
Okay.
So yes, and they told us that it was going to be available to us when they came in here, so it wasn't like this is a big surprise to anyone that is watching, so.
I read that and I thought, well, maybe they meant all the backup information or something and not the report itself. But I agree with Representative Belcher. That was written in a, I don't know.
Yeah.
Disarming way, I would say.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's also something I'd like to submit to the committee once I get access to my internet. There's something called The Psychology of Pandemics, written by Stephen Tyler from Canada, dealing with this whole issue and trying to frame it in such a way I think would be helpful for the committee to look at and review, but I think also for the report itself, and talking about how do we deal with pandemics going forward, dealing with the psychology of the pandemics versus looking at it from a science point of view. I think it's important we include that. I'll send it to you right now.
Okay, thank
Stephen
you.
Taylor. Taylor. Sorry, Taylor. Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking Department of Commissioner from the Department of Agriculture.
It's sort of it's a short article basically, but it does cover some of the key points we're trying to make as far as the psychology. It deals with how society deals with pandemics and the fear that goes along with it.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Appreciate it. Anybody else have any other comments? I am not going to schedule a meeting for next week if that's okay with everybody. So probably the Friday after that, which would be the 20th, I guess. Okay. All right. So thank you, everyone. Good luck on Tuesday for all of those that are running. And have a great weekend.
Thank you.
All right. We are adjourned.